higher education, particularly in terms of communities of practice. And so what does that mean to you? And what that means is, if you recall, all the people that sat up here this morning and talked about how meaningful their experience was in terms of their learning and their cohort, and how valuable all of these presentations are. Aimee deChambeau's research is no less than making sure that this happens. So this is about success. Why is it important to be successful for people in higher ed, and particularly people such as yourselves? And you're the ones that are going out to change the world. And without you being successful in this program, you may not have that opportunity quite in the same way. So I love the work that Aimee's doing. I wanted to introduce as well her committee, Drs. John Savory from the University of Akron, Dr. Beverly Santo, who is our Dean and Curriculum Entrepreneur Extraordinaire and Program Visionary, and Dr. Noriko, who has joined us, and Dr. Noriko Hana, who's from Indiana University, who's actually, her expertise is about communities of practice and how the frameworks for knowledge sharing works. So this is important stuff for you. It has to do with you and your research. Some of you in this room may have been research participants in this particular research. So I don't want to steal your thunder.
I have a reveal too. Yeah, have a microphone.
Oh, you have microphone.
Okay. So I do want to thank Dr. Hara very much for being here, because I know it was a long trip for her, and when I needed to find an external reader and I thought about, well, how am I going to figure out who could be an external reader, I looked at who I was citing the most besides the person whose model I used. And so I was really just exuberant that she could agree to be a reader for me and to even kind of come and participate in this. So I appreciate that very much. So what I'm going to talk about today is supported student success. What I wondered was, how do students come together to support themselves as students? And I'll get into that in more detail in a minute. I do want to tell you what I'm going to go over quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about the concepts of community of practice and let you know what that is. I've kind of front-loaded my slides with some conceptual stuff so that you know what I'm talking about when we get into the details later. I'm going to look at my problem statement and some assumptions that I made. This is an emergent research project, so I didn't start out with a hypothesis or a real solid research question, just kind of this problem that I wanted to look at and to see how that developed over time as I did my research. We'll look at some guiding questions, and I'll talk about how the guiding questions that I started out with changed as I started to do my research, which was really great that I had this emergent design already, because it allowed me to do that within my research framework. We'll look at the rationale and significance quickly. The research approach that I took, I'll base it in what the literature says about communities of practice in higher education. We'll look quickly at my findings and whether or not I answered my questions, and then I'll give you some recommendations at the end. So at the very, most minimalist level, my focus was on graduate student success. This is important because there's really almost nothing written about success at the graduate student level. There is tons of information about student success for undergraduates and how to set up undergraduates to be successful in a program. But there's very little at the graduate student level. So what I'm looking at is specifically graduate student level success and the development of a student from when they're a novice in a program, a novice student, to when they become an experienced student in a program. My goals were to deepen the available research in this area and to actually try to formulate a theory of supported student success. How will we know if we're helping support success in graduate students? And to contribute to the paradigm for a shift in education that makes it a more sustainable education model. So my study determined if a community of practice developed among doctoral students, and if it did it function as a supportive structure that enabled students to succeed all the way through graduation. Should I adjust this? So first, let's just talk quickly about what is a community of practice and what does practice mean in the sense of community. Kind of the detailed succinct but detailed description is that it's a set of relations among persons, activity, and world over time and in relation with other tangential and overlapping communities of practice. Really what it is it's people who are interested in learning more about a particular area. It's about people who are cooperating to develop their skills and their understandings within a particular practice. What do they want to be practitioners of? So it's very focused on helping people do what it is that they want to do. There are lots of different communities of practice, and you can belong to, almost an infinite number. So what I'm looking at in terms of practice here is the practice of being a student. It's also defined as being an intrinsic condition for the existence of knowledge, because this community provides the interpretive support necessary for making sense of its heritage. This becomes really important later on, because as we look at communities of practice over time, you need to have some thread that ties community this year with community next year with community 5 years down the road. Because everything that we co-create as knowledge within our community here as students is important for other people to interpret what they're trying to figure out in terms of being students next year, year after that. Has anybody read the book Too Big to Know? It's by David Weinberger, and I actually recommend it. It's a pretty fast read, but his general premise is that there's just too much information for one person to know, for one person to be an expert in. And so at that point, the smartest person in the room is the room itself. So think about that. So the smartest person in the community is the community itself, especially when we're talking about focusing on a particular practice, in our case, the practice of being students. So this provides an intellectual as well as a social support structure for whoever the practitioners are. And in our case, this would be a social structure that students can use to learn from each other what their roles are, what their responsibilities are as students, what resources, skills, and tools are relevant and available to them to use to be successful. And they can receive critical feedback and help from their peers when trying to navigate things like theory, method, and research design. Because at this point, we move away from the content of what you're studying, because we all study different things, actually, within the field of sustainability education. So there are these other elements that we have that we can build on in this particular group. A lot of it is research design, a lot of it is understanding method, a lot of it is understanding whether or not you're presenting yourself well and you can practice with people. That's pretty much what the community of practice is and how it's defined. Another key feature for community of practice for me, and as I define it from my research, is the fact that they develop spontaneously. You cannot mandate a community of practice into existence. So what this means in terms of informing graduate program design is that as an institution or as a program, you can't mandate, you can only be aware and facilitate and enable a community of practice to develop among the students. So you can't make it happen, but you can help it happen. Another key feature of this, or understanding here, is that in some of the literature I've read, they really talk about graduate students as being assumed to be expert students already. If you made it to this level, you already know how to be a student. And that's not actually the case all the time. We do different things as graduate students than we did as as PhD students than as master's students. And it's quite a bit different than undergraduate. So we are not actually necessarily expert students. And this community can help us move from being a brand new graduate student all the way through that trajectory to expert. As we move through that trajectory and we become more experienced, we continue to help the new people who come in. Or they learn from us, or they learn from the footprints that we leave behind in terms of artifacts like shared calendars, already written research proposals, dissertations, and things like that, the artifacts that we leave behind. So the problem I was really looking at was how might the development of a community of practice be fostered to support individuals in their practice of becoming successful students. Some of the assumptions that I made are that communication rhythms, whatever they might be, they develop naturally. Somehow, some way they develop. You and I talk, you talk to her, she talks to her, three of us talk together over here, and then one of us goes off and talks to another group. So there's some kind of rhythm that means that information flows throughout this group, even if it's not directly from me to you. Within this rhythm of communication, essential information is exchanged. How do I go about writing my presentation? What do I need to do to fill out an end of semester summary? Every time I try to write a post for Moodle, it disappears, and then I have to rewrite it. Oh, so do it in Notepad first. Copy and paste it. Little things and big things. We share this information. We create knowledge together. We co-create knowledge. We negotiate meaning together, and that's really a key feature of a community of practice, is this co-creation of knowledge. And we share this through stories, advice, and experiences, along with artifacts. So originally, another assumption was that given a sufficiently strong and focused network of relationships and communication patterns, a community of practice can develop, and it can support students in their practice of becoming and being, because it's a trajectory, becoming and being successful students. So from this point on, I'll just say being successful students, but it is a continuum. Just continue to think of it that way. So originally, and this was what was so nice about having this kind of emergent design from the beginning. Originally, I wanted to know what the content was of the stories that people were telling to each other, because I thought if we could figure out what the content is, from the perspective of improving a program, we could, as a program, try to address those questions. So if the question is about difficulties filling out end of semester summary forms, then we fix that as a program. So it's really kind of narrowly focused on trying to find out from the lived experiences of the students what these little things were that a program could just support so that students could move on to having other kinds of more intellectual conversations with each other. As it turned out, as I started to get into the research and look at what people were doing, there is, so sort of what do they call it, the end of the story at the beginning.
The punchline?
The punchline.
Spoiler.
The spoiler alert. What I found was that a nascent community of practice was actually forming. So, wow, what do we look for next? And the big thing to look for next is really where and when are the stories being shared. Not so much the content of the stories, but when and where are they being shared. So that was what the big shift was in my research. So, also, I talk about storytelling quite a bit. I want to clarify that storytelling means a number of different things. It doesn't just mean telling a story. It means exchanging some kind of information. It's a relation of information. I talk about clever solutions that I come up with. You tell me clever solutions that you came up with. All of those things qualify in this particular context as storytelling. When you talk to people in a particular way, it establishes trust. It establishes credibility, and it makes you want to talk to them more. And you're more likely to reach out to somebody that you've established this trust with. In terms of novices, it inducts them into the language and lingo of the community. It generates emotional connections. So this is where storytelling comes into this. It means a number of different things, but I just say it sort of this generic way. So some of my questions originally were, does the information being shared help individuals succeed in the program, all the way from novice to experience, which then I categorized as an achievement context. And then I was asking, do robust communities of practice exist? Ones that are really going to last for a while, not just sort of fly-by-night groups, like work groups and things like that. Does a robust community of practice exist or develop between cohorts as well as within a cohort? And this becomes really important later on because I was very focused on individual cohorts when I realized that the community of practice cannot sustain itself over time unless there's cross-cohort communication. So this becomes one of the really big components of my findings, is that you have to have the cross-cohort communication to make it last over time. Then I was wondering where and when are stories being shared, and are there enough opportunities? Turns out there's enough opportunities for individual cohorts to share stories, but maybe not as many for cross-cohort sharing. And then I did wonder if storytelling and exchanges of information helped people in a single cohort make it over that leap from the first year to the second year when you stop having the core classes together and you're kind of on your own and you're feeling a little bit lost. You know, where do the story sharing, where does that come into play? Why is this a significant study? Because in general, depending on what the discipline is, 50% of graduate students who enter a program will not finish even after 10 years. And that's a pretty high number. That's probably mostly in the sciences. The 43% is probably more down in the social sciences areas, but that's really the range. Success, when it's measured by institutions, is really measured at this sort of big data level, which is stuff that an institution can compare with another institution. Do GRE scores predict whether or not people will persist through a program? How many people did you graduate in what amount of time? Things like that. So it's really focused up there and not so much at the individual person level. There's a Council of Graduate Schools PhD completion project that they take the big data stuff and then they meet with deans of graduate schools and they kind of talk about, well, what are the things that we can do to improve programs and keep people in them? So they identified a number of different areas where individual programs can concentrate to try to keep their students in the programs. And of the 6 or 7 areas that they've identified, this research can help and provide additional data in their mentoring and advising category, their curricular and administrative processes category, and in their program environment category. So how are we treating students and how do we help them? It's a repeatable research design. I totally intend to repeat this with different types of educational delivery models. We're a nice hybrid model. That was great for gathering data and kind of establishing whether this design would work. I'd like to do this in a totally online environment and a totally face-to-face environment and see what the differences are. Ultimately, I think that there's got to be a shift for online learning in terms of how students are going to connect with each other, and this provides some baseline data for me to jump off of. It also contributes to sustainable education because it contributes to the learning about learning about learning. So this is a very high level understanding of what's happening when people are learning. Stephen Sterling talks about 3 different levels of learning. He talks about basic, which is just learning, meta learning, which is learning about learning, and then there's epistemic learning, which is learning about learning about learning. And this is very important for making that shift to a sustainable education model. My research approach was participant observation. I did a survey, I ran some anecdote circles, did some interviews, and I looked at some of the historical documents from the college to set some context for where we are and where we want to go. Within the context of the existing research, I wanted to tell you a little bit about where this fits, because there is not a tremendous amount of research in this area. What I did find basically fell into 5 categories. People use communities of practice as a framework for an analysis of a program, which I've done a little bit here. It's a nice framework to see whether a community has formed and how it's affecting students. It can be used, it's been used in the literature as a framework for reflection. The difference between the reflection and the analysis is the reflective research is usually done by students who are reflecting back on what it was like for them in a particular program. Now, at the very end, one of my recommendations is that faculty and programs should be aware of what's happening, and they should make connections between students when possible. So one of the reflective pieces was there were students who were really isolated in the program, who probably wouldn't have finished the program, but a faculty member put them in touch with each other, and they created a small community of practice that helped them succeed and actually finish and graduate from that program. So that's the kind of reflective information can teach us things like that. It can be employed as a learning strategy. Now this is really interesting because the A.T.M. Wenger, whose model I'm using, specifically states that communities of practice is not a pedagogical strategy, not a pedagogical model. But some people use it as a learning strategy and at the same time tell their students that this is a model that we're using as a learning strategy. So they don't try to just implement it. They try to implement it so that the students who are kind of trying to develop artificially a community of practice are also learning about community of practice as a model so that they can go out into the world and be more aware of what their place is in their other professional communities of practice. It can be implemented in terms of developing a community of practice, where instructional staff encourage this to happen within a program or a course. And it's also sometimes addressed within the context of multi-membership. So if you're a member of 2 different communities of practice or 3 different communities of practice, how does this affect your success as a student? So if you're coming from a professional community of practices, let's say an elementary school teacher, and you come to your school and you're part of the community of practice of students, do they interfere with each other or not? Turns out they don't, but that's what they mean by within the context of multi-memberships. I do want to point out that there's always multiple communities of practice, and it's the crossing of the boundaries that really keeps them fresh. So you don't want a community of practice just to stagnate, and as like with any ecosystem, if you like push a product, perturb it in some way, it's going to react, and that's one of the ways that they keep fresh over time. So we had these 5 broad categories. Then, in terms of those categories, what are the roles that this can play in terms of student success? So there are 3 main roles that these can play in student success. They can be supportive or facilitative. They provide a structure. They provide a strategy for coursework. They provide a structure to bring students together. They can influence what I call internal drivers, or they could be affective learning. It increases self-reflection. It helps students share their progress, which helps them keep pace with each other. Increases persistence in programs, helps students gain confidence, because as you talk to other people in your community, you find your own voice. And then it does actually have an impact on learning, based on the literature. It's social support for learning. It's collaborative learning. It broadens students' experience, and it co-creates knowledge, helps students co-create knowledge. So it does have an impact on learning. So the literature says, yes, the community practice can help with student success. Quickly, I'm going to go through the participants' work, some influences on my design, how I collect the data, and a little bit about data analysis. So what I did was I sent out a survey to 85 alumni and current students from cohorts 1 through 8 in this program. 41 people responded to the surveys. That was a nice response rate. One of the questions on the survey was, are you willing to be contacted again for future participation in this research? 31 people said that they were willing to be contacted again. They were the pool of people that I used then for my anecdote circles and my interviews. The exception was, if maybe some of you remember last year, I had an open call at Symposium for participants in the anecdote circle, and 3 people who hadn't done any of the other stuff showed up for an anecdote circle. So that was nice. So we had 44 total individuals who participated in the study, from cohorts 1 through 8. So this was a qualitative mixed methods approach. I was influenced by community of practice theory and then used it as a framework. Whole systems thinking figures into this quite strongly because we're talking about a system. A community of practice really is a system. And we're not looking at linear connections necessarily, and we're not looking at small parts and trying to identify discrete instances. We're looking at the impact of the entire system. I used some ideas from appreciative inquiry, which can be an organizational change strategy, but I didn't use it as an organizational change strategy because this wasn't action research. But I did use appreciative inquiry in terms of trying to find out what's happening that's helping. I'm not looking, this was not a model that looked for deficits to correct. This is a model to look at what's working so that we can imitate it in the future. And then I used anecdote circles. Now this was a data gathering method, but anecdote circles also are sometimes used as an organizational change strategy. Often when you run a circle, which I'll explain what they do in a minute, as soon as you start talking about something and prompting people on a particular topic, it starts to change within an organization. Just that act of talking brings people together. So I used participant observation, which was just me being part of this program. And it helped influence how I asked questions, but I didn't use any participant observation for individual pieces of data. It was more like, okay, I'm watching what's going on, and let's see what questions I can ask. Documents included things about the history of the college. I ran a survey that set contextual data, primarily some demographic data. I was interested to find out if our group of students were similar to what the literature talks about when they talk about students. You know, were we really having, did we have a lot of students that had dependents at home? Did we have a lot of students who were in a much older or younger age group, things like that. I also asked things on the survey, like, what's your definition of success? Which I then checked with some of the other methods later. Anecdote circles are small circles that are run. They're different from focus groups because they don't ask a specific question. You give a prompt, and then people give specific examples of something within that area. So I think one of my prompts may have been about engaging with mentors or something like that. And so people would give examples, specific examples. And you ask for anecdotes because you want it to be very short. You don't want people to feel like they're obligated to tell a story from beginning to end. And then I did interviews to double check the other data. So these are just types of information and the methods I use to collect them, but I'll move along. I used grounded theory methods to analyze the data. All the data I got back, I coded. As soon as I started coding, like the survey information, I had it partially coded. I got anecdote circle data in. I started to code it. If I came up with new codes from the anecdote circles, I had to go back into the surveys. So this was this iterative process. I wrote memos to myself about what was going on, which helped me later kind of analyze my bigger categories. Which then when I came up with the themes and categories, that's when I really started to think about how can I conceptualize this at a much bigger data, at a much bigger level. So the findings. I'll just tell you, the biggest finding I found, my biggest finding, was actually that it's something that I added to the idea. Here you see digital habitat, which we're going to talk about in a second. But I added to the idea of digital habitats the notion of something I'm calling microclimates. And a digital habitat is how the technology enables groups to come together in a particular area, a virtual area. What I'm thinking of in terms of microclimates, I want to differentiate between this habitat itself. This could be a habitat, symposium. Between the habitat itself and the characteristics or qualities of the communication space that protects that habitat, that nurtures its growth, or just permits it to emerge. So that's the microclimate. So I added that to this digital habitats idea. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the student characteristics that are important for understanding how we relate to what other people are doing research on, digital habitats, and some of these characteristics of communities of practice that I use to very strictly and narrowly decide whether or not we had a community of practice developing here. This is based on work by Etienne Langer. So we come from really diverse backgrounds. They're almost, at least for cohorts 1 through 8, there are almost no duplicate master's degrees. There are a lot of maybe biology undergraduates, but there aren't that many master's degrees that duplicate each other. So we are really diverse, which is great because it's perfect for this model, because if you have diverse people in a room trying to solve a problem, you're more likely to come up with a good solution instead of a solution that everybody already knows how to come to because we're all experts in the same field. So, and there's also very little overlap in professional organizations. So we don't have a lot of communities of practice necessarily that we share outside of this program and our community as students. Some of the literature refers to the unique characteristics of graduate students. We're older, we have mortgages, we have houses, we have kids, we have parents that we have to take care of, things like that. So I wanted to know, did we match what the literature kind of alludes to? So half of us have life partners, slightly less than half of us have dependents at home, and nobody said that they had dependent parents at home, only kids. And approximately a quarter are from single female households. More women replied to this, that participated. I'll give you 30 seconds to read this. When what I did was I asked students what student success meant to them. I asked it on the survey, and I asked it in the interviews, and then I compared to make sure that I had the same information across responders. So this is really about completion of degrees as a personal accomplishment as well as a professional milestone, and that's important. People want to increase their scholarly abilities, including gaining a deeper understanding of the disciplinary content, improving their academic skills. There are a whole lot of things that students identified as indicators of success for them in their program. So if you look at these, I want you to think about, how does this differ from the way most institutions measure success? And then think about how it compares to what you think of now as success, indicators of success for you. And then compare it to what you thought success was when you were an undergraduate. Just to think about. We communicate in a bunch of different spaces. Men and women prefer email overwhelmingly for all the different kinds of support strategies. I'll skip over this a little bit, but I will tell you one of the things I also found was that Facebook has been unbelievably influential in increasing cross-cohort communication, increasing engagement between students from different cohorts and within cohorts when they're at symposium and when they're outside of symposium. And it almost feels silly to say that because it seems like maybe it's this silly social media network, but it's really hugely important. It was a place where people connected when they couldn't connect before. So there are individual cohorts who have their Facebook sites. My understanding is that some cohorts even set up Facebook sites to meet each other before they even came to their first colloquium to meet. And we have a different kind of relationship now. I can feel it as a participant observer, the difference between before Facebook was popular when I first started and now when people are really pretty engaged. I'm so running out of time. So the characteristics of a community of practice are meaning, community, and learning. And within this particular structure that I use, the ATN Rikers model, we have indicators that we are doing all of these things. So yes, my answer is yes. We have created a community of practice within the students here at Prescott. So we are negotiating meaning together. We're figuring out what it means to be a student. We are giving each other advice. We are helping each other figure out what we want as our research topics, how we'll present the data. We participate with each other as individuals and in community. This is really important too. There are dyads and triads, for example, that come up a lot in terms of this communication rhythm and strategy when I studied what the students are doing. And that's how the communication spreads throughout the whole group. Informal participation came up as being extremely important for almost all students. Because this, informal participation, when we hang out there, or when people rent a house together, or when you engage a little bit on Facebook, it builds that trust that then helps you later on. The reification is when we create artifacts that help us remember, it's almost like physically, what we negotiated in terms of meaning. It makes the abstract concrete. So people who share calendars and schedules, and those are reified objects. So one of our missing things was a place to put some of those reified objects, which recently is being taken care of by the deChambeau site. So that's one thing that will help. So we had a number of different ways that we communicated with each other. We had email, we had Skype, we had Illuminate for a little while, Moodle for the first year or so, and then and people have negotiated how they're going to communicate in the best way possible. But that reification was missing. You could post documents on Facebook, but not too many people do, and eventually, if we did that, there would be so many posts that you wouldn't be able to find anything. We're mutually engaged in the work of negotiating the meaning of being a student. We are engaged in this as our joint enterprise, being students, and we share this set of resources for how we negotiate this meaning. These can be strategies, these can be conversations, and these can be sets of instructions that we come up with for each other. So we have all of these things. So that's, we meet the first two criteria. Now the shared histories of learning, this is important, especially in terms of having your community persist over time. Because it's the shared histories of learning that, that help a new student make sense of something that has gone before. The shared histories of learning are based both on reification, which are the creation of these artifacts, which can be strategies also, and what we remember from participating. So when you participate, and then when you make something concrete, that becomes a sort of shared history of learning. And that's when we go back to this intrinsic value of these communities of practice. It helps us understand what we're doing now in terms of what our history was. So did I answer my questions, my original guiding questions? Yes, we're developing a community of practice, but it's in its very early stages. Yes, artifacts are created and shared. Students are teaching each other what they learn in terms of common elements of the program. And those are the things like research design, methods, those kinds of things. But the opportunities for sharing are absolutely required in order for the community of practice to persist, to engage and to develop initially, but then also to persist over time. So opportunities for sharing are things that you need to take advantage of as an individual and things that you need to provide as an institution. There are small groups of collaborators and colleagues that exist, so we do have some cross-cohort communication, but it's not as robust as it could be. It's changing, though, based on Facebook, and with deChambeau that might help too, because people will then be able to look at what people have produced before them, dissertations and dissertation proposals. Cross-cohort relationships are critical to the community practice lasting over time. Stories take place in a variety of different places using a variety of different communication methods. So there isn't one way that an institution can say, I'm going to support the community practice by providing this particular tool. There needs to be lots of different modes, and the students will figure that out. And it is happening now. This informal time at symposia provides opportunities for sharing, and engaging across cohorts on Facebook's had the biggest impact. I partially answered the question about whether stories are helping keep a cohort together. It's only partially answered because I shifted away from what the content of the stories was to the focus on opportunities for sharing and how important they were. So what are my conclusions? A community practice is possible and it can be beneficial. Just to clarify, community practice can be harmful if it becomes like an echo chamber where people just repeat the same thing over and over again. So, but I wasn't looking for that. I was looking for whether or not a beneficial community practice could develop. So it's possible. Social microclimates are critical for the development of the community practice. And the cross-cohort microclimates are critical for sustaining that community practice over time. So this essentially here is my theory. And it meets the criteria that Anselm Strauss outlines for whether a theory is a theory or not. It faithfully represents what the data illustrates. I really tried very hard to faithfully illustrate what represent what the data illustrated. Its conclusions can be easily understood, unless you tell me differently at the end of this session. The interpretation is pretty broad and conceptual. It really is. I mean, in the actual written dissertation, there's lots of specific examples, and you could turn it into something that was very specific, but it is pretty general. Does this develop? How can we help it develop? And it can actually be used to guide future actions. Understanding that microclimates are important for socially to begin the development, and then across generations to sustain it over time. So my recommendations. For institutions and faculty, be aware and responsive if you see that a community practice or something like it is starting to develop. Help it along if you can, but don't mandate anything. Don't push it. Don't poke at it. Just let it happen. And if you can facilitate it in some way, do so. Put people together. Make physical spaces available. If possible, support it with technology. But don't expect just because you provide the technology that everybody's going to show up. They may go someplace else. Help make the connections. Never mandate or interfere, unless maybe if it's becoming an echo chamber and it's destructive in some way. But you can't mandate this stuff because it's kind of like when you're assigned a book to read, you don't want to read it, you don't like it, and then later on you read it because you want to and it's a great book. Never mandate or interfere with that development. But be responsive and facilitate what's possible. For students, be mindful about what's happening. Engage in what's called community maintenance. If cohort 3 had decided one day that they wanted to sit down with future cohorts and have some cross-cohort communication happen, we may not have developed a community of practice, at least not as fast as we did, because they sat down with us and we sat down with the next cohort at the Raven in the same way and told the same stories. Okay? So that was the beginning of the cross-cohort communication. You can thank cohort 3 who also established the Journal of Sustainability Education for pretty much the same reason. Initiate and sustain cross-cohort connections. I know that's hard, but that's what's going to keep this going over time. And remember, when you are a faculty member out in a program, or a dean or a program designer, that you should be aware and responsive, but not mandate. In terms of sustainable education, I looked at Sterling's whole system shift. Okay, what he's talking about is a shift in education. So it becomes sustainable education. Not sustainability education, not education for sustainability, it's sustainable education. And what he was saying is that we need a paradigm shift that more reflects living systems or an ecological metaphor. And this community of practice does that. Community of practice in general is an ecosystem. So we have this as part of a paradigm shift. Right? The purpose, if we're going to make a shift, is to no longer simply prepare for an economic life. We want to be able to facilitate trans and interdisciplinary thinking, and this kind of diversity that happens in a community of practice. The smartest person in the room is the room itself. Diversity will help de-silo higher education, which is going to be essential for adjusting the purpose. In terms of policy, he's talking about making a shift to the development of potential and capacity, and for continuous learning. And the students who defined success their own way reflected this change. And they're the same group of students who created the supportive community of practice. So you can see how this will work, if it's allowed to happen. Then as a practice, education should be participative, active, social, and it should be situated learning, which is exactly what a community of practice is. It's a social learning structure, and it epitomizes situated learning. And future research just digs further into some of these things, but I want to let you ask questions if you would like to. I already use up all the time.
We don't actually have any.
Does anybody have any questions?
Sure. I'm curious to know how you came up with the recommendation with respect to faculty's influence or involvement. I was kind of hoping that I'd ask you a question about faculty, and then I got disappointed that you actually put it in your recommendations, and I'm like, I wanted to look smart. But how do you come up with that, with those recommendations? How do you draw that from students? If you can conjecture this, that would be helpful.
Well, that was partly because of this other research where the students had reflected on their program, where they were having trouble in their program and their faculty put them together and they created a community practice out of that. So it's to be aware of that, have that kind of awareness of what's happening in the program. There are students who are either put together by other students in this program or maybe recommended that they get in touch with another student by a faculty member. And that's what I mean in terms of faculty being aware. Does that answer your question? Should have that simple word.
So your study really focuses on this cohort model. How do you think this can apply to a non-cohort?
That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. I think that it focused on a cohort model because the cohort model was available in terms of the students who I was studying. In a program that does not have a cohort model, it may actually be even more important to be aware when students are need some kind of support and whether they start to swirl around themselves and figure out how to support this, and then how would that look over time? Because you don't have cohort 1, cohort 2, to try to measure whether or not the information is getting shared from one student to another. It's an excellent question, and that's exactly the kind of thing I'd like to study in the future. So I have this. I know I can repeat it. I can repeat it in an online-only program. I could repeat it in a non-cohort model program. I could look at a program that maybe uses learning communities, which are a little bit different, because they don't persist over time. They don't develop spontaneously. They're created by the institution. Those kinds of things. Excellent question. I don't think anybody else is using the room, right?
Like I said,
You had considered, or what role academic culture or institutional culture might play in contributing to students, I guess just the values of the university and how that would influence?
Yes, absolutely. That's such an excellent question, because if you have a department that has its own community of practice culture that is not diverse, that is oriented in a particular direction, then you will lose students who aren't oriented in the same way. So there's an interesting study that a woman did where she compared a biology department that was very diverse to a chemistry department that was not. And that chemistry department lost women in that program like crazy. And some of them not only left the program, they left the profession. They decided they didn't want to be chemists because the culture in the department was so bad. So it may not be truly a community of practice, but that is exactly how that can affect. Another thing that institutions and then students would also need to be aware of, and it's not necessarily a value thing, but if an institution makes changes and the historical memory that the students have as part of this shared repertoire and community practice doesn't match that, then things can get thrown off, like timelines for submitting your dissertation, things like that. So that is not necessarily a value, but how students can sort of develop their own support structure that is then all of a sudden at odds with what the institution needs. Question? Good question. Others?
Just real quick, I'm curious.
My background, I am interested in lifelong learning, actually. I'm interested in teaching and learning in higher education. I'm interested in how faculty can learn to be better faculty members and support students that way. So those things combined are what interested me in this. So my job right now is I run the department in the library at the university that delivers all of the electronic resources to the students and faculty on campus. It ties into this in a number of different ways. I like to think of it as a teaching and learning opportunity. You know, how can I help faculty help their students and help themselves in their own research? I am interested in this in terms of online education because we deliver materials for online as well as for on campus. If we restructure in terms of online education and what that paradigm might be, where will those students get those kinds of interactions? Maybe I can develop some kind of support structure within the library system, that would help facilitate something. I don't know, but that's kind of where it fits in. Mostly that I'm interested in the teaching and learning part of my job and how to help faculty. And then for students for lifelong learning.
Question online from Lauren.
Take the research from here.
Oh, where will I go from here?
Yeah.
I will go, I would like to find an all-online program and repeat this. I have one back there in the back of the room. Just volunteered. I definitely want to see, because this hybrid model is so perfect, because we have this face-to-face time. When I teach online, I deliberately try to put the students together, even though I know they hate group work. I try to put them together so that in different combinations throughout the semester, so they have some, maybe they'll make a connection with somebody and have a support structure later on in the program. One of the big parts of this research was whether or not students were really isolated and how did this help. And this helps significantly in terms of reducing isolation, which is one of the big things that's identified in graduate education as being a problem. So where I would like to go from here next is an online program and see if I can measure it in the same way. Then maybe a face-to-face program. Noriko mentioned maybe a MOOC, which would be really interesting because that's just so different. You know, how does a community develop among people who take a MOOC or a series of MOOCs?
My turn. I'm trying to extract from this the learning and value for those of us running programs like this. And the main insight I seem to get is more to it than that.
Yeah.
More than you could discuss in here. But
I think the big there are a couple of takeaways for a program. I mean, watch what's happening with the students. Because often a community practice is going to develop because there's some unfulfilled need. That's one reason they develop sometimes. So one of the famous studies was on copy machine repairmen. And when they tried to de-skill the repairmen, they took away the resources that the organizations provided for them to be experts in their field. Those workmen went to each other. How did you manage this? How did you do that? How did you fix this? They started to tell those stories to each other, and that's how their community practice developed. So if a community of practice develops, it may be because there's a problem. Maybe not. But it could be because they're trying to solve some sort of problem. They're trying to find support where support doesn't exist elsewhere. One of the original thoughts I had was if you determine that a community of practice is developing, and it's because of something that's trivial, let's say, administrative, like the EOS forms. Let's just take that as an example. That maybe the organization just figures out how to handle that for students, take that cognitive load off of them, and let them have better, more high-level intellectual discussions about their research design. Those kinds of things. So it's being aware of what's happening with the students and what they're doing and what it's in response to.
what they're needing, to be.
You couldn't necessarily force something on them that would make them feel more successful. But you can let it happen and you can support it in a number of different ways depending on what it is. Like the deChambeau, I think, is without even realizing it. The students came up with it. They knew they needed a place to share this information. Without having to ask, I need to ask you for your dissertation. And then you tell me, hey, you know what, maybe Marna's got a great dissertation for you to look at. Or Marna says, well, you know what, mine's not so good, how about looking at the polls? So it's not like this one-to-one email chain. It's an archive of reified objects.
They want something that persisted by the moon.
Yes. Yes. Anybody can get through it. Thank you all very much. I know it's stretched everybody.